It belongs to the peculiar dignity and also the peril of our age that human consciousness has been led to a point where it can no longer be carried by inherited instinct, nor guided by outer authority, nor even sheltered by the half-dreaming certainty that earlier epochs possessed. We stand, as it were, upon an inner threshold, and the most decisive fact of this threshold is not that human beings have become clever, nor that civilization has become complicated, but that thinking itself has changed its place in the world order. What once flowed as cosmic intelligence through the universe, what once was carried by divine spiritual beings and experienced by humanity more as a gift than as a personal achievement, has gradually descended into the sphere of individual human inwardness. This descent has made possible the modern sense of freedom, but it has also exposed thinking to a new kind of coldness, temptation, and deception, especially where the human being wants to live in thoughts as though thoughts were merely mirror pictures without moral weight. When one looks at the history of consciousness with spiritual scientific seriousness, one recognizes that since approximately the 15th century, a special condition has matured. The human being has been allowed to unfold his existence within a dangerous sphere in a way that was formerly not possible. It is the sphere in which Ahrimanic beings can meet the human being precisely through the independence of the intellect. This was necessary, for without it, the human being would not awaken to the modern I, not as a mere word, not as a sentimental self-feeling, but as an inner deed that can stand on its own ground. Yet what was once undergone more half unconsciously has reached a limit. The time has come when it must become conscious. Otherwise, the same forces that granted freedom will harden into bondage. Bondage not imposed from outside, but arising from the human being's own surrender to a purely mechanized orientation of mind and soul. Here we touch the crisis of human consciousness in its most intimate form. One may speak much about crises in economics, politics, culture, but the spiritual researcher must point to the deeper crisis, the crisis of how the human being carries his thoughts. In earlier times, thoughts were not experienced as mere products of the nervous system. They were lived more as revelations, sometimes in pictorial, imaginal forms, sometimes as inspirations through tradition, sometimes as the transparent garment of a divine world that still felt near. The modern consciousness soul, however, must accept a world that can indeed be felt as divinely formed, yet is no longer immediately experienced as divinely unsouled. In such a work world, the human being must bring real ethical life out of his own being. He must become the bearer of moral impulses in full wakefulness, not because the world compels him, but because he inwardly recognizes the necessity of moral creativity. And now, precisely in this work world, there can shine, if the human being does not merely speculate but learns to feel truthfully, something of Michael's being and present deed. Yet one must grasp this correctly. Michael does not come as a physical apparition. He does not push human thinking into fantasy. He does not provide a ready-made spiritual intoxication that would relieve the human being of moral responsibility. His working remains within a supersensible region that directly borders the physical world, and for that very reason it preserves the human being's freedom. The approach to Michael is not by passive impression, but by an active placing oneself into the spiritual, whether one thinks or wills. Only through such inner effort can Michael become a reality for modern consciousness, without the soul being diverted into luciferic illusion. To understand why this is so, we must consider the relation of Michael to cosmic intelligence. In spiritual history, one can perceive phases. The intelligence that once belonged wholly to the divine spiritual world becomes, in a sense, objectified as cosmic idea order. Later, it is carried onward by the stars as an implanted past order, and finally, it takes its way evermore into the human realm, so that human beings develop own thinking. With this approach of intelligence to humanity, the danger also increases that the human being will enter into a binding connection with Ahrimanic powers, because Ahriman strives to be the flawless carrier of intellect, to dazzle the human soul with a seductive brilliance of immediate present intelligence, severed from living spirit. In the great picture that lives in human consciousness, Michael with a dragon beneath his feet, there is the expression of these supersensible facts. Michael thrusts the Ahrimanic powers continually into a deeper region than the one in which the human being unfolds. He keeps open the possibility that the human being, precisely in freedom, may meet intellect without becoming the servant of the Ahrimanic orientation. But Michael cannot compel. The age of compulsion has ceased precisely because intelligence has entered the domain of individual humanity. Michael can only set before the soul a majestic, exemplary deed, an image and an impulse, so that the human being may choose. And the choice is ultimately between two orientations in the same sphere: to turn toward Christ in the spirit mood that once was present unconsciously during the descent of humanity to intellect, and that must now be taken up consciously, or to seek oneself in separation from spirit and thereby fall into the Ahrimanic orientation. This is why Steiner can speak of a decisive spiritual fact, that Michael has taken over the spiritual guidance of human affairs, and that anthroposophy wishes to be in its essence the message of this Michael mission, so that human beings in freedom may follow Michael and find with the Christ force the path out of the Ahriman sphere into which they necessarily had to enter. The crisis of consciousness is therefore not merely an intellectual dispute about worldviews. It is a concrete situation of the human soul standing in a realm where thinking can become either a bridge to spirit or a chain to mechanism. One may now ask, if Michael does not force, what is the characteristic gesture of his working? It is significant that Michael's relation to intellect is not cold and frosty, not soulless. He bears within himself origin forces of the gods and of the human being, and therefore he stands by intellectuality in a warm, inward, soul-filled way. Yet this warmth is bound to an uncompromising seriousness, because to be connected inwardly with intelligent content as Michael is connected means to fulfill the demand of bringing no subjective arbitrariness, no wish or craving into that content. Otherwise, logic itself becomes the caprice of a being rather than the expression of the cosmos. From this seriousness arises the true Michaelic task for modern humanity: to learn a kind of thinking that is at once exact and moral, a thinking that does not play with ideas, but experiences in ideas a responsibility, a thinking that does not merely reflect the world as pictures, but becomes the organ through which the human I can serve truth without egoistic intoxication. For if the human being seeks freedom without the tendency toward egoism, if freedom becomes pure love for the deed that is to be carried out, then he can draw near to Michael. But if freedom becomes the proud feeling of revealing oneself in action, if egoism slips into the claim of selfhood, then the human being stands before the danger of entering Ahriman's domain. And here the crisis becomes very concrete. The question is not, do you believe in Michael? The question is, how do you carry your freedom? Do you carry it as love for the deed or as self-display? Do you carry it as inner truthfulness or as a cleverness that wants to outwit reality? Do you carry it with the capacity to endure the God-formed yet seemingly God-unensouled world and to kindle within it moral life from your own being? Or do you seek substitutes, sentimentality, fanaticism, spiritual luxury, or the intoxication of ideas that promise warmth but actually estrange the soul from reality? In this connection, it is deeply significant that Steiner points to a change in time. Michael has been on the way from the cosmos toward humanity since the 8th post-Christian century. Yet he truly arrives in his earth office into which his cosmic office transforms, only in the last third of the 19th century. This is not meant as an external chronology. It points to an inner turning point of civilization. Something becomes possible for a growing number of human beings. To unite intelligence with spirituality in full wakefulness, without losing the sharpness of thought and without falling into old, dreamlike clairvoyance. This is the positive possibility, but the negative possibility is equally great. That intelligence, severed from spirit, becomes the instrument through which demonic Ahrimanic powers obsess human culture, precisely by making people believe they are being realistic when they are merely becoming inwardly mechanical. Thus, one may say, the crisis of human consciousness is the crisis of whether thinking will remain mere earth intelligence that forgets its cosmic origin and therefore becomes prey to those powers that want to imprison the soul in calculation and dead abstraction, or whether thinking will be reawakened into a Michaelic mode, clear, disciplined, ethically warmed, so that it can become again a bearer of spiritual reality, not by escaping the modern world, but by permeating it with truth and moral strength. But to speak of Michael's time in a living way, one must also grasp what kind of battle is meant. It is not a battle of outward factions. It is a battle in the invisible realm of motives, habits of thought, and the soul's relation to the supersensible, and it is precisely here that the deepest turning point begins, quietly, without noise, as a reordering of inner life. For Michael's work is not sensational, it is formative. It seeks to lead the human being in freedom through the very sphere where Ahriman dwells, toward Christ, so that the human I does not lose itself, but becomes capable of a new communion with the spirit world, not through compulsion, but through consciously chosen truth. If we look more closely at the inner structure of the crisis that characterizes Michael's time, we find that it is rooted not in a lack of knowledge, but in a one-sidedness of knowing. Humanity has learned to think with great sharpness, precision, and technical mastery, yet this very sharpness threatens to sever thinking from life itself. Steiner emphasizes that modern thinking has become extraordinarily capable of mirroring the external world, while at the same time losing the capacity to experience its own inner reality. Thoughts are treated as neutral instruments, as if they carried no moral weight and no spiritual consequence. It is precisely here that the danger lies. In earlier epochs, the human being did not experience thinking as something produced solely by the brain. Thought was felt as something received, something that streamed through the soul from a world still filled with divine beings. Even when this experience was dim or dreamlike, it protected humanity from the illusion that thinking could be morally indifferent. In the modern age, however, the human being must learn anew that thoughts are deeds, real events in the spiritual world. Michael's mission consists precisely in reawakening this awareness, not by taking thinking away from humanity, but by demanding that it be carried with inner responsibility. Steiner describes how, in the supersensible world, Michael stands as the guardian of cosmic intelligence, which has now become human intelligence. This guardianship does not mean domination, it means protection. Michael protects the human being from the temptation to absolutize intellect, to believe that what is logically consistent is therefore true in a deeper sense. Achaemon seeks to exploit this temptation by convincing humanity that reality can be exhausted by calculation, measurement, and technical control. In doing so, he offers a seductive certainty, a world that can be mastered without moral effort, without inner transformation. Michael, by contrast, confronts the human being with a more demanding path, the path of truth that must be lived, not merely known. The crisis of consciousness becomes acute because the modern human being stands between these two possibilities while fully awake. There is no longer the shelter of unconscious guidance. One must decide, inwardly and repeatedly, whether thinking will serve life or reduce life to dead concepts. Steiner points out that this decision is rarely dramatic. It is made in countless small acts: how one judges another person, how one approaches work, how one treats truth when it conflicts with convenience or ambition. Michael's battle is fought precisely here, in the everyday moral texture of thinking. It is also essential to understand that this crisis does not arise because humanity has gone too far, but because it has gone far enough. The descent into materialistic consciousness was necessary. Without it, the human I would not have become strong enough to stand on its own. But now the time has come when remaining within this descent becomes destructive. Steiner emphasizes that evolution does not move automatically upward. It demands conscious participation. What was once destiny must now become task. In this sense, Michael's time is not a promise of comfort, but a demand for maturity. The human being can no longer expect spiritual guidance to come as vision, command, or external authority. Michael works only where the human being develops courage in thinking, courage to face uncertainty without escaping into cynicism or blind belief. This courage is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, steady, and inwardly disciplined. It expresses itself in the willingness to let truth reshape one's life, rather than using truth as a weapon or ornament. Steiner also stresses that Michael's working is inseparable from the Christ impulse. Michael does not replace Christ. He prepares the soul to meet Christ consciously. In earlier times, The Christ impulse could be experienced more instinctively, more through feeling and tradition. In Michael's time, this is no longer sufficient. The human being must learn to recognize Christ in the sphere of thinking itself, not as an abstract idea, but as a living presence that demands honesty, clarity, and selflessness. Thinking must become transparent enough to allow spiritual reality to shine through it. Thus, the crisis of human consciousness reveals itself as a threshold experience. Humanity must learn to endure a world that appears on the surface to be devoid of spirit, while at the same time refusing to surrender to that appearance as ultimate truth. Michael stands at this threshold, not pushing the human being across it, but indicating the direction. He points toward a form of thinking that is neither mystical dream nor technical calculation alone, but a living, moral activity of the I. In this way, Michael's time calls the human being to a new inner posture. One must learn to carry clarity without hardness, freedom without arbitrariness, and knowledge without pride. This is the inner work demanded by the present age. Where it is taken up, even in small measure, the crisis becomes a possibility for renewal. Where it is ignored, the same forces that once liberated humanity threaten to bind it ever more tightly to a world emptied of meaning. If we now ask how this crisis of consciousness appears within the soul itself, Steiner leads us to a decisive observation. The modern human being increasingly experiences a split between knowing and being. One may know much about the world and yet feel inwardly empty. One may master complex systems and yet feel powerless before the simplest moral decisions. This is not accidental. It is a symptom of the fact that thinking has become detached from the deeper layers of the human being. Michael's time is marked by the necessity of healing this split, not by retreating from thinking, but by deepening it. Steiner emphasizes that the consciousness soul, which characterizes our age, must learn to carry spiritual content in full wakefulness. Earlier forms of spirituality work through images, symbols, and inherited moods of devotion. Today, these can no longer serve as reliable foundations. They either become empty repetitions or slide into subjectivism. The modern soul must learn to experience spirit without losing clarity. This demand creates tension because clarity easily hardens into abstraction, while spiritual warmth easily dissolves into vagueness. The crisis arises precisely in this tension. Michael's working can be recognized by its insistence on truthfulness in thinking, not truthfulness as correctness alone, but truthfulness as inner alignment between thought, feeling, and moral intention. Steiner describes how, in Michael's realm, thoughts are experienced as living beings, not as dead tools. To think falsely is therefore not merely to make an error. It is to introduce disorder into the spiritual world. This is a difficult idea for modern consciousness, yet it points to the responsibility that now rests upon the human I. The human being is no longer protected from the consequences of his thinking by unconscious guidance. He must learn to take responsibility for the inner life he generates. This responsibility becomes especially evident when we consider the role of technology and abstraction in modern life. Steiner does not reject technical thinking. On the contrary, he recognizes it as a necessary achievement of human evolution. But he warns that when technical thinking becomes the model for all thinking, the soul gradually loses its connection to living reality. Everything becomes calculable, predictable, manageable, and inwardly dead. In such a condition, the human being may feel efficient, yet increasingly disconnected from meaning. This is one of the deepest expressions of the present crisis. Michael's task, as Steiner presents it, is to help humanity carry intellectual clarity without surrendering life. This requires a new inner discipline. One must learn to pause within thinking itself, to sense whether a thought is alive or merely mechanically correct. Such sensing is not mystical. It is a refined form of conscience. It develops when the human being practices inner honesty, when he resists the temptation to use intelligence for domination, self-assertion, or convenience. Michaelic thinking is therefore inseparable from humility, not humility of weakness, but humility before truth. At this point, Steiner draws attention to a subtle danger, that human beings, sensing the emptiness of materialistic consciousness, may flee into false spiritualities. These promise warmth, meaning, and belonging, but often do so by weakening the I. They bypass critical thinking, appeal to emotion, or offer ready-made answers. Steiner sees such movements as luciferic counterweights to Ahrimanic hardness. Both are evasions of the real task. Michael's path does not lead away from the crisis. It leads through it, demanding endurance rather than escape. This endurance is itself an initiatory experience. To remain inwardly awake in a world that appears spiritually mute requires strength. Steiner emphasizes that Michael's time is not characterized by spectacular spiritual phenomena, but by the quiet heroism of maintaining truthfulness amid confusion. The human being must learn to live with unanswered questions without falling into despair or cynicism. This capacity is one of the most important fruits of Michaelic schooling. Gradually, through such schooling, the human being begins to experience thinking differently. Thoughts are no longer felt as something imposed by the outer world, nor as arbitrary constructions of the brain, but as something that can become transparent to spiritual reality. In such moments, the Christ impulse can be experienced within thinking itself, not as an image or a feeling, but as a moral presence that guides and corrects. Steiner indicates that this experience marks a decisive step toward the future evolution of consciousness. Thus, the crisis of human consciousness reveals itself as an opportunity. It forces a human being to confront the limits of intellect without abandoning intellect. It challenges him to become inwardly active, to transform thinking into an ethical deed. Michael stands beside this effort not as a comforter, but as a guardian of seriousness. Where this seriousness is accepted, the crisis becomes a threshold to renewal. Where it is rejected, the same forces that sharpened intelligence threaten to hollow out the soul. In this way, Michael's time demands from humanity a new form of courage, the courage to think truthfully, to live responsibly, and to endure freedom without escaping into illusion. If we bring all these threads together, we can see that Michael's time confronts humanity with a question that cannot be postponed. Can the human being bear freedom without losing spirit? Steiner makes it clear that freedom is not a comfortable possession. It is a condition that must be continually justified through inner work. The crisis of human consciousness arises precisely because freedom has become real. No outer authority, no inherited instinct, no automatic spiritual experience can take the place of what the human eye must now accomplish from within itself. In earlier epochs, the spiritual world stood nearer to humanity, but the human being was less awake. Today, the situation is reversed. Humanity is awake, but the spiritual world appears distant. This distance is not a loss in itself. It is the space in which freedom can arise. Yet this space can become terrifying if it is not filled with moral activity. Steiner emphasizes that Michael's mission consists in helping humanity endure this distance without collapsing into either despair or illusion. Michael does not shorten the distance. He gives the strength to stand within it. One of the most significant aspects of this situation is that the crisis does not manifest equally in all individuals. Some feel it as anxiety, others as meaninglessness, others as intellectual arrogance, and still others as a restless search for spiritual excitement. These are different symptoms of the same underlying condition. The I has not yet fully learned how to inhabit its own thinking. Michael's time, therefore, demands differentiation. It demands that each human being honestly recognize where the crisis touches them personally, rather than projecting it onto external enemies or abstract cultural forces. Steiner also points out that the present age requires a new relationship to evil. In former times, evil was often experienced as something external: demons, temptations, hostile powers. In Michael's time, evil increasingly works through distortions of human capacities themselves, especially through thinking that is cut off from moral feeling. Ahriman does not need to tempt humanity with obvious falsehoods. He needs only to encourage the belief that thinking is neutral, that intelligence can be divorced from conscience. Michael's task is to counter this by awakening the experience that every thought has spiritual weight. This awakening does not happen through fear, but through dignity. When the human being begins to sense that his inner life matters not only for himself, but for the world, thinking changes its character. It becomes more careful, more exact, yet also more alive. Steiner describes this as a transformation of thinking from a shadow process into a light-bearing activity. Such thinking does not lose clarity. It gains depth. It does not retreat from reality. It penetrates reality more fully. At this point, the connection between Michael and the Christ impulse becomes especially clear. Michael prepares the way. Christ is the content. Michael educates the soul so that it can meet Christ consciously, without confusion and without compulsion. In Michael's time, Christ is not encountered primarily through outer events or inherited belief, but through the awakening of conscience and truthfulness within the I. The Christ impulse becomes a living reality, wherever thinking becomes loving and love becomes truthful. Steiner insists that this path is not reserved for a spiritual elite. It belongs to the destiny of humanity as such. Every honest effort to think clearly and morally, every attempt to unite freedom with responsibility, already participates in Michael's work. The crisis of consciousness is therefore not a sign of decline, but of transition. It shows that humanity has reached a point where it must consciously choose its future orientation. Thus, Michael's time reveals itself as an age of decision, not dramatic in outward appearance, but profound in inner consequence. The human being is asked to become a conscious bearer of spiritual intelligence, to transform thinking into an ethical force, and to let freedom mature into responsibility. Where this task is taken up, the crisis becomes a gateway. Where it is avoided, the same freedom that could lead to renewal hardens into inner emptiness. In this sense, Michael's time is not something that simply happens to humanity. It is something that must be realized through human beings. The crisis of human consciousness is the soil out of which a new form of spiritual life can grow. If the human eye finds the courage to stand in truth, to endure freedom, and to let thinking become once again a bridge between earth and spirit,